Thank you, Mary. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I know we're on Zoom. I talk with my hands, so if you see them popping in and off the screen, that's how it is. Uh, like Mary said, my name is Chris Ray. I am an elder law attorney. I'm a partner with Fitzwater Law. I've been practicing elder law for 15 years, and I've been with Fitzwater for 10 of those years. We have about 10 attorneys, and we handle matters like adult guardianship, probate, estate planning, special needs planning, and long-term care planning, which is also Medicaid. Today, I want to talk about long-term care and how to pay for it. Like Mary said, there's a handout, but you don't need it for this. It's very dense, and I tried to include all the information that you could possibly need in it for the overview of the Medicaid process and program. So like she said, you don't have to write it down, but if you want to take some notes, that's up to you. When we talk about long-term care, we talk about different types of care. There's in-home care, and in-home care could be maybe a couple hours a week to 24/7 in-home care. And that could range from 1,000 to a couple thousand a month, all the way up to 20 to 30,000 a month for 24/7 in-home care. That's the widest range you're going to see, and that's the most expensive that it gets is 24/7 in-home care. We also have things like assisted living. Assisted living is a little bit of help. It's a structured living environment, but it's not all hands on. It's just a little bit of help where you need it. And that can range anywhere from $4,000 to $8,000 a month. A higher level of care, we have adult foster care, which is someone took a home and converted it to hold 1 to 5 occupants or 1 to 5 clients that will that have similar needs. And with that, it can cost anywhere from, I'd say, 6 to 10,000 a month, around that area. Then we move into skilled care and memory care. And those can run anywhere from $7,000 to $15,000 a month. I don't know about y'all, but that's a significant amount. There are very few of my clients that I've run into over the years that have enough resources and income to just pay that without it denting um, their principal or starting to erode their resources. So that brings us to, how do people pay for that? There are about 4 to 5 ways to pay for long-term care. But if you really narrow it down, there's only two. Well, let's take a look at that. First off, in this pie chart, we have about 10% or less, and that covers long-term care insurance, which used to be more prevalent, but now it's like finding a unicorn. Uh, People can't afford it. You have to get it when you're really young, and is it really worth it? That's the question. If you have that, great. That can help offset your cost of care. If you don't have it, you're with the majority of folks who don't have long-term care insurance. Part of that statistic is veterans. Under certain circumstances, the VA will pay for care, but it has to be in a VA-approved care setting. Very few people end up with that because those care settings are, don't want to say exclusive, but there are requirements to get in there, and they usually never have availability. So it can be very difficult. And also in this small 10%-ish wedge, we have Medicare. Isn't it lovely that they named Medicare and Medicaid so similarly, but they're such different programs? That's not confusing in the least. So for Medicare, Medicare will cover what we call rehabilitation. If you are hospitalized and you get discharged into rehabilitation, Medicare covers 100% of the first 20 days and 80% of the next 80 days up to 100-day maximum. 100 days is technically long term, but it's not really going to help out if you need care beyond that, which most folks will. That brings us to the other 90% of the pie. 40% of people are private pay. Those are folks who are paying out of pocket, whether they have, let's say, infinite resources and can pay indefinitely, or they're spending down to qualify for the Medicaid program. In Oregon, couples are responsible for each other's medical expenses. They're liable for each other's medical debt. So the Oregon Department of Human Services sees a couple, a married couple, and that's a very important clarification. Uh, you're either married or you're not. They don't recognize registered domestic partners as married, but you can be married and separated. They still recognize you as married. But we don't need to go into that right now. So a married couple, they look at you as one financial unit. Anything held individually or jointly by either of you is going to be considered. And we'll go into that a little bit later. But because of that, you can transfer things between spouses and there's no problem, there's no penalties. Also, there are spousal impoverishment laws that make it so we take care of the spouse that doesn't need care. We make sure they have enough resources to live out the rest of their life without, as one of my clients so eloquently put it once, living in a tent under a bridge. And we don't want that. We want you to be able to receive care and make sure that your spouse doesn't have to worry about things like that. Now, on the other hand, your kids are not going to be financially liable for your care. Because of this, the Department of Human Services doesn't care if they get an inheritance. There is a program called estate recovery, and we'll go into that a little bit later as well. I just want to briefly brush on it, where if you receive Medicaid services, or you or your spouse, either of you receive Medicaid services during your lifetime, they can recover against the second of you to pass's estate up to the amount that they paid out to a certain extent. So there are some exceptions to that rule, but we're going to go over the main rules today, and maybe we can go over some of the exceptions with questions later. That being said, that's 40%-ish. And then a little over 50% of folks are on the Medicaid program. Now, when we talk about Medicaid, there are a couple different flavors. There's the Oregon Health Plan. That's still technically Medicaid, but that's more of like a supplemental health insurance. There is, but there's also the Oregon Supplemental Income Program Medical. You don't have to remember that. And that's what covers long-term care Medicaid. That's what we'll be talking about. When I refer to Medicaid, that's the program we're talking about. Medicaid is it's a joint state and federal benefit. So the overarching rules are federal, but each state kind of puts it in place a little bit differently. It is a means-tested benefit. What that means is it's needs-based. You don't automatically qualify for Medicaid. You have to meet certain criteria in order to qualify for Medicaid, and you have to apply for it. Unlike Medicare, which you can just enroll in when you retire, or if you receive SSDI for a couple of years, it automatically kicks in. That's more of an entitlement benefit, whereas Medicaid is a needs-based benefit. And that's important because when we look at Oregon, you have to pass 3 different tests in order to qualify for the Medicaid program. Let's start with test number 1. The first test is based on your service priority level. That's their terminology. But really what it is your medical need. They want to know how many of your activities of daily living can you handle on your own? Which ones do you need help with? And where do you fall in those areas? So for this, they give us a scale. And believe me, the scale hurts my heart because it doesn't make sense and it doesn't even go to 20. It goes from 1 through 18. 1 is the highest level of care. A little counterintuitive, But one is someone who is in a coma that needs everything done for them, needs all of their their activities of daily living, ADLs, handled for them. 18 is someone who can handle all of their activities of daily living. To give you some contrast, 17 is someone who needs just a little bit of help with maybe bathing and dressing. So they put a cutoff on that scale. You have to fall between 1 and 13 in order to meet this test for the Medicaid program. There are a lot of different factors that we look at. We look at things like, can you bathe yourself? Can you dress yourself? Do you need help with, daily hygiene? Um, they look at elimination, your ability to, it used to be your ability to, use use the bathroom by yourself, but they've changed elimination a little bit since uh, you last heard this. And now it only deals with things like colostomy bags or catheters that you can't manage yourself. Then we look into also bigger things like mobility, uh, the ability to eat, and cognition. And the reality of all of this is the only things that will really drop you below 13 on this scale are the last three: mobility, eating, and cognition. With ALS, mobility and eating may be more prevalent than cognition, um, at least earlier on. So let's take a look at that. Now, eating, it's it's not the ability to go out and go grocery shopping, come back, prepare your food, and eat your food. If that were the case, I had some friends in undergrad that would pass this test. But when we look at eating, we look at the ability to bring the spoon from the bowl to your mouth successfully. And we also take into account any kind of choking or aspiration risks that may be present. When we look at, so let's move on to mobility a little bit. Mobility is it's a little more clear. The least clear is cognition. It's got a lot of factors that we may not go into today, but mobility is broken into two different sides. We have ambulation and transfer. So legally speaking, transfer is the ability to get up out of bed to standing, or up from a bed to a wheelchair, or from a wheelchair to a commode on your own without anyone physically helping you. Ambulation is getting from point A to point B and back on your own without anyone, again, physically helping you. You can use assistive devices, and this is all inside your home. They don't count anything outside your home. If you can't get down the front walk to the car, they don't care. I care, but they don't care. Not for this. So the litmus test, or basically our, hey, where are you on this, is, can you get up in the middle of the night? Can you walk to the bathroom, use the restroom, and then go back to bed on your own? If you can, you probably won't meet the need for mobility. But if you cannot, at least one day a week, every week for a minimum of 4 times a month, then you will be considered a substantial assist for mobility and will drop to a 10 on the scale and meet this test. Cognition's a little bit different. Cognition is the ability to look out for your own safety, make your own decisions. Oftentimes we run into this with individuals who have more mental health issues or age into things like Alzheimer's or dementia, and they lose the ability to make their own decisions, to make themselves understood, to sometimes they have challenging behaviors where maybe they dress themselves maybe inappropriate for the weather or just inappropriately and then take off down the road and get lost. And things like that, that's when we look at for cognition. But for today, mobility and eating are probably going to be your strongest factors. And keep in mind, you don't have to need assistance with eating and mobility, just one or the other to drop you down below that 13. And then once you fall between 1 and 13 on that scale, you pass the first test. The second test we look at, so number 2 of 3, is income. If you felt my frustration with the scale, wait till you hear about this. Income, let's first define income. DHS, or the Department of Human Services here in Oregon, they look at income differently than the IRS. For example, if you have an IRA or some sort of pre-tax retirement plan, anything you pull out of that plan, any required minimum distribution that you take is considered taxable income. DHS only counts fixed sources of income because they're going to count that IRA most likely as an available resource, so they're not also going to double count it as income. Fixed sources of income, we're talking Social Security, we're talking pensions, things like that, that you can't just go to them and say, hey, I want to cash this out. Can you imagine going to Social Security and saying, hey, I'd like to cash out my lifetime benefit? You would get the strangest look in the world, and they would say no. So for income purposes, we're looking at only fixed sources of income. Pension and Social Security are the main sources that we run into. They say, they being the Oregon administrative rules, say that if you make more than $2,829 per month gross, then you make too much to qualify for the Medicaid program. That is what is called the income cap, CAP. I say that a lot, and people always hear income gap or income tax, and it's cap. So like that's the limit, that's the cap on income that you can have, and it's your gross income that you can have before you no longer qualify for the Medicaid program. You're probably thinking, let's say I make $3,000 a month, all of that stuff I talked about before, you still can't afford that. So what do you do? Back when they came out with the income cap, there were some attorneys in Colorado who had the same problem. They had clients who made more than the income cap, but they couldn't afford the cost of long-term care. So they came up with this instrument called an income cap trust. This instrument gets you around the income cap. It went through a lot of adjudication, a lot of judicial review, and finally, the attorneys won because the state had problems with that. And instead of getting rid of the income cap in its rules, they changed it. They have, if you make more than $2,829 a month gross, you don't qualify for the Medicaid program. And they stuck a rule underneath it. However, if you do make more than this, then you can put an instrument in place called an income cap trust, and then you will meet this criteria. You will still be eligible based on income. So the short of this is if you make, and the number I'm using is this year's number. The number goes up every year with the cost of living adjustment January 1st. But if you make more than $2,829 a month gross, then you need an income cap trust. If you make less, then you pass. Either way, you can pass this test, and then we can move on to the third test. So just as a recap, you need to have the medical need or healthcare need as the first test. Second, income, you either need an income cap trust or you don't. Either way, you can pass that. The third test is probably where I get the majority of my questions from individuals, families, married couples, all of my clients. The third test is assets, or what we like to call resources. When we look at resources, there are two different classifications for resources. There are available resources and unavailable resources. The easiest way to figure out what the available resources are is to take the unavailable resources and just subtract them. So what's not available? And when we say available, we don't mean to the person, we mean they're not available to pay for care. They're protected for the individual who's going to apply for the Medicaid program. So what is protected? If you own a home and either you or your spouse live in the home and it's your primary residence, it's protected. If you own one vehicle, that vehicle is protected. If you own three vehicles, we'll say the most expensive one is protected. So you get your home and one vehicle. Three, your personal property or your stuff. You're not going to apply for the Medicaid program and they're going to show up and they're going to be like, hey, got a lot of nice stuff around here. You should probably sell that and pay for care. That's not going to happen. Now, don't get me wrong. If you have things like if you have a Picasso on the wall or if you have a gold coin collection, um, then those are going to be considered investments and those would be considered available. But if you're like, well, let's take my mom, for example. She collects teapots. I don't understand it. It's not my thing, but she enjoys it. As far as I'm aware, there's no underground market for teapots. She's not going to get rich off of teapots. And that is personal property. Personal property also includes things like clothes, furniture, um, jewelry to an extent. And I don't mean jewelry that you already have. I mean, like if you're going to spend down, and we'll talk about this later, you can't go out and just buy, a $200,000 diamond because they look at that as an investment. Although I have had clients who would buy something like an emerald ring because they always wanted one and it cost maybe 5 grand and that's fine. But I digress. So your personal property doesn't count. You could have pictures on the wall, doesn't count. That's three. Four, if you have any kind of prepaid funeral arrangements, as long as they're irrevocable, that means they cannot be cashed out, they cannot be, well, revoked, then that's considered unavailable and does not count as a resource that you should be able to use for care. And then number five is if you are a married couple, the well spouse, the one that does not need to apply for Medicaid, that spouse's income doesn't count. And as a matter of fact, there are ways, depending on what that income is, to get the well spouse some of the ill spouse's income while they're going into care. So all of that said, everything else counts. Everything else is considered available to pay for care. As a single individual, you have to spend down your available resources to $2,000 or less. That standard has been there since I started practicing. It might have been there since Wes started practicing, but he's not here. Uh, I mean, he's still alive and with us, but he's not physically here today, so I can't ask him that. But yeah, for at least the last 15 years, $2,000 has been the resource maximum for a single individual. That's often why people look at the Medicaid program as welfare, because you can only have, as a single individual, up to $2,000 of available resources. So you do have to spend down to almost nothing. However, you do have to understand that just because you go on to Medicaid doesn't mean your quality of care will change. A lot of people, because they saw it as welfare, have said or have understood that you'll have a diminished quality of care if you go onto the Medicaid program. And that narrative was pushed a while back by folks who were, I'm not blaming folks, But there are some folks who are selling things like long-term care insurance and things like that that fit their narrative. So that's what was put out there. Really, how it works is, let's say you're a single individual, you have $50,000. You go into care into, let's say, a skilled care facility who has a contract with Medicaid. That means they will accept Medicaid once you qualify for Medicaid. So you'll be privately paying for, let's say it's $10,000 a month for 5 months. That's 5 months. I don't do math on Wednesdays, so my numbers are going to be super easy. Then you would pay for those 5 months, and probably around the end of month 4, apply for Medicaid. You go on to Medicaid, and you would stay there. You would transition onto Medicaid, and you would be at the same facility with the same caregivers. The only difference is not only, instead of having family looking out and yourself looking out for your quality of care, you have two other layers of protection. You have the long-term care ombudsman who oversees Medicaid licensed facilities, and they make sure that the facilities aren't doing anything, I don't know, super shady or anything that they shouldn't be doing. The other level is the Medicaid case manager. They make sure that the facility stays licensed. They make sure that, they meet all the criteria and that they're providing a level of care that is necessary for keeping their contract with the state. So arguably, you get more oversight, but your care should not change. The only thing that may change is if you have a single room, you may end up in a studio or a shared room, depending on what kind of place you're in, but that it widely varies depending on where you are. Let's change the example a little bit because most people aren't concerned as a single person about, I mean, they're concerned that they get the care they need and that's about it. If you have a spouse at home, however, typically I see people's main concern is making sure that their spouse has enough money to live off of the rest of their life and that they don't end up in the tent. So let's take a look at that. It's completely different with a couple. We'll take a look at what the worst case scenario is, and then we'll look at some ways to make it better. In order to do that, I'm going to make up some people. Let's say Frederick and Wilhelmina, or Fred and Wilma for short. Totally made up those names. Did not pull that from Saturday morning cartoons. Now, Fred and Wilma, they have a home. It's a bit outdated, to say the least. They have one vehicle. It's even more outdated. It's man-powered. And they have, let's say they have about $356,000 in investments, checking, savings, available financial resources. We'll make it simple. First off, for Medicaid for a married couple, we want to look at the first day that that couple spends any amount of their money on care for, let's say Fred, because let's be honest, the Social Security actuarial tables say that the ladies are going to live longer than the gentlemen. And I tell my wife it's because of her. She doesn't think I'm funny, but I'm hilarious. So let's say Fred's going to need care first, and Wilma is going to be the well spouse, the spouse at home who does not need care. They start paying for Fred's care. Let's say they only pay someone to come in maybe like 3 hours a week on one day so Wilma can go out and not be the caregiving spouse. Oftentimes, when you have a spouse at home who is taking care of, their spouse, so Wilma's taking care of Fred, she steps into the role of caregiver and kind of steps out of the role of spouse. And the only way to bring that back is to have someone else being the caregiver. And it's very important because I've run into spouses at home who are taking care of someone who has care needs that are significant, and they often decline in health faster than the person who has the care needs. You have to recognize when it makes sense to bring caregivers into the home or to look into a more structured living environment for the sake of both spouses. That being said, they start paying for someone to come in, let's say 3 hours a week for Fred. We call that the first day of the continuous period of care. This is important. It's important because when Medicaid looks at a couple's resources, they look at a snapshot, a moment in time of when they started paying for care and didn't go longer than 30 days without paying for care. If you do go longer than 30 days, let's say you pay for someone for care for like 3 hours in one day, then you go 2 months and then start again, it restarts your continuous period of care. The reason this is important is because you don't want to spend down resources, at least not aggressively, to qualify for Medicaid until you've established that continuous period of care and you're going to not go longer than 30 days without paying for care. Otherwise, it resets. Can you imagine spending down and then they're like, oh, great, you spent down, but it resets. So now you get to spend down again. You only get to keep half of the half that you had. We'll go into that in a second too. But let's say they've started their continuous period of care, and these are the assets that they have: house, vehicle, personal property. Furniture could use some updating too. It's mostly made of rock, if I recall correctly. And they have $356,000 of available resources. The reason I use that number is because, generally speaking, you take the amount of available resources, and this is how you calculate the spend down. You cut that in half, Wilma gets half, and Fred's half gets spent down to $2,000 or less. However, there is a maximum amount for Wilma. That's roughly $154,000. So if you add that to Fred's 2,000, so if you have 154,000 over here and 2,000 over here, you go down to $156,000 total, which means they have to spend 200,000 of their $356,000. If you ask the Department of Human Services, they will tell you that you should spend it on Fred's care, which you can do, and that's a legitimate answer. And that's the worst it gets. But let's make that a little bit better because that's not great. Remember all of those things that we talked about that were considered unavailable. You can spend money on Fred and Wilma, or sorry, Fred and Wilma can spend their money on themselves, and they can pay for anything for their benefit. They can renovate the house. They can sell their house and buy a new house. They can buy personal property. They can get new furniture. They can upgrade their kitchen. They can get new personal property. There's the emerald ring example that I had. I mean, there's no fixed amount that you can spend on jewelry, but if you spend too much, it doesn't really pass the taste test for the Department of Human Services, and they'll red flag it. They can trade in their vehicle or they can scrap it at this point, and they can buy a new vehicle. And one vehicle, any value, is considered unavailable. I mean, it doesn't make sense to go out and buy some sort of exotic sports car because then you have to pay for parts and upkeep and insurance. But getting something new and reliable that's still under warranty, great. So that's the home, the vehicle, personal property. They can go out and they can prepay and pre-plan for their funeral arrangements. As long as, like I said before, it's an irrevocable plan. They can also, little known fact, pay for their kids or grandkids or all of their descendants' funeral arrangements and make that irrevocable. And nothing says happy holidays like, hey, I pre-planned for your funeral arrangements. But it's something you can do. Doesn't mean you should do it. These are just options. Let's say they've already updated their house. Let's say that they live in a brand new house. They got a car like a year ago, and Wilma's in love with it and doesn't want a different car, and they don't need any personal property. What are they going to do with the $200,000? There is another option. It's called a single premium immediate annuity, or lovingly called a Medicaid annuity. What it is you're basically taking that $200,000, you're giving it to one of the companies that will create one of these. So it's an insurance company, and then they will pay it back to you in equal monthly payments over the course of Wilma's projected lifetime based on the Social Security actuarial tables. I didn't do that calculation because I don't know how old Wilma is, but let's say it's $3,000 a month. So for however many months, she'll get $3,000 a month back, maybe nominal interest, until that $200,000 is paid back to her. If she passes, now keep in mind, this annuity, it's irrevocable. If she spends down, if she needs to aggressively spend down, she gets the annuity in place, and then Fred passes 3 months later, she's getting $3,000 a month till it all pays back to her. I've had it happen a couple times, so taking into account somebody's prognosis makes a big difference too. However, it will pay to Wilma. If she outlives that time period, she gets all the money back. If she passes before that time period, then it goes to Fred. If Fred had passed before her, then it would go to the state to pay them back for anything they paid out uh, for either Fred or Wilma through the Medicaid program until they were fully paid, and then it would go to, let's say, Pebbles, if they were to name their child that. So that brings me to a little bit of estate recovery. Estate recovery is Oregon's program that says, we're glad to pay for your care, but after the second spouse passes, we don't care about your kid's inheritance. So let's say when Fred passes, and then later down the road, Wilma passes. Pebbles gets a letter in the mail that says, we're sorry for your loss. Please pay us $200,000. I'm paraphrasing, but that's kind of what it says. They keep track. They keep a tab of how much they pay out for care. Now, this shouldn't dissuade someone from going on to Medicaid because the Medicaid rate for care is less than the private pay. So if you were to pay privately for all of the care that you received, you would be paying more than if you were to just pay back the state after the second spouse passes. So the Medicaid program is a good program and it has its benefits, but Pebbles may be out of luck if the estate's less than $200,000. It's all going to the state. And the estate recovery rules are the most fluid. They change the most often, and it all depends on what the rules are when both Fred and Wilma pass. Currently, maybe they'll be able to recover half of what Wilma has, roughly, depending on what the assets looked like ahead of time. But it all depends, and that's part of a larger conversation that you should have individually if you work with an attorney on Medicaid or long-term care planning. That's another thing. There's a lot of misinformation out there. The internet gives us this wonderful bounty of information and no indication of whether or not that information is accurate or if it applies to whatever state you're living in. I know that I'll Google Oregon Medicaid every once in a while, and I'll find a website that is like an archived website. The numbers are 5 years old and the information's out of date. Or someone who doesn't know exactly what they're talking about, or even someone who can talk about it on a national level, but doesn't know the state specifics. So talking to an elder law attorney like myself, who does Medicaid planning, is really important and can save you a lot of money. I'll never forget a gentleman who came to me to get conservatorship, which we don't need to go into that, but financial authority over his wife because they needed to sell their house because he needed to pay for her care. He didn't need to do that. I mean, at that point, he did, But if he had come to us 2 years before, that would have never had to happen. There are a lot of protections in place, and it's really good to talk to someone who knows what those are. And the other piece is oftentimes you'll need to transfer assets from the ill spouse, so Fred, to the well spouse, Wilma. And in order to do that, Wilma needs the authority to do that. And if Fred gets to the point where he can no longer make his financial or medical decisions, Wilma needs the authority to step in and help out with that. In that respect, estate planning is not a bad idea. A lot of people think of estate planning as will or a trust or something like that. And I think I saw a question pop up. We'll go into those in a minute about a revocable living trust. Yes, that is part of estate planning, but another very important piece is planning for incapacity. The Oregon Advance Directive is Oregon's answer to healthcare power of attorney. Your agent under the Oregon Advance Directive, your healthcare representative, is the one who can make your medical decisions for you if you can't make them for yourself. If you have not signed one and have not executed one of those instruments, then the only option people have to legally make your medical decisions for you is guardianship. And that's not inexpensive and it's not fun. I do adult guardianship for a living, but people don't tend to come to me when they're having fun. Also, for finances, power of attorney. But specifically, you want a power of attorney that lets your spouse transfer everything to themselves. So they can transfer things into their own name without any kind of restrictions. It's very important, especially for estate recovery. And it it's something that not the if you go online and find the what is it, LegalZoom or something like that, power of attorney form, they don't have that in there usually. As an attorney, in fact, an agent under a power of attorney, you have the duty of loyalty, so you can't benefit yourself unless it's specifically written in there. So you want to be able to have someone who knows what you're looking at moving forward uh, to put together a power of attorney that will let your spouse or let you, depending on who you are in that relationship, Fred or Wilma, um, manage everything without having to go through the court system. Because once you get in front of a judge, things get expensive and it's kind of a flip of the coin, roll of the dice to see how things end up. So in a nutshell, that's what we look at for the Medicaid program. Um, you can qualify for it, but you just have to meet those three tests: medical need, income, and you have to meet the resource test. And then you can apply for the Medicaid program. You probably want to apply about a month before you'll be there, but you're probably going to want to talk about that and the timing with someone far ahead of time, far ahead of when you get to that point. At this point, I want to turn it back over to Amber and Mary so we can go over some of the questions.